My name is Grace, and I am 32 years old. Last November, my mother exiled me from our family Thanksgiving dinner. She did not banish me because we had a screaming match or a bitter falling out. She uninvited me because I work manual labor. She told me my calloused hands and dirty boots would embarrass my sister Caroline's elite future in-laws. She wanted a pristine holiday table, and my blue-collar reality was a stain on her curated socialite image. What my mother did not know was that while she was treating me like a dirty secret, I was the sole legal trustee controlling my sister's $15 million inheritance. It was money my sister desperately needed to fund her extravagant wedding and hide a crippling mountain of hidden debt. 5 days before Thanksgiving, my family called begging for a lifeline, and what my sister did next ruined her own future. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Welcome to Sofia Told Stories. Now let me take you to a crisp November morning, 90 feet above the Atlanta pavement, where my family's perfect facade finally started to crumble. The mid-November air carried a deceptive chill, but up on the scaffolding, the Georgia sun beat down on my neck. I wore a faded canvas jacket coated in a fine layer of red brick dust. My company specializes in restoring 19th century masonry across historic districts. It is grueling and exacting work. I stood on the metal grating, gripping a heavy hammer, chipping away rotten mortar from a decaying Victorian facade in Grant Park. My hands were rough and my knuckles were scraped. I liked the dirt. Honest labor leaves a mark you can wash off at the end of the day. I paused, wiping a streak of sweat from my forehead with the back of my leather glove. My phone vibrated in my chest pocket. I pulled the device free, bracing myself against the metal railing. The screen displayed a new text message from Beatrice, my mother. I had offered to host Thanksgiving this year. I recently finished restoring a classic craftsman home in Inman Park. It was a beautiful house, bought and paid for with the profits of my own contracting business. I wanted to host the holiday to show her that my trade had built something lasting. I wanted her to sit at my dining table and finally acknowledge my success. Beatrice had declined my offer during a phone call the previous week. She wrapped her rejection in the rigid, passive-aggressive politeness native to the Buckhead neighborhood. "Oh, bless your heart, Grace," she had purred over the receiver. But Wyatt's parents are accustomed to a certain standard of entertaining. We need a formal dining room, not a construction zone. While she spoke, I could picture her standing in her foyer, obsessively rubbing the bare ring finger on her left hand. It was a nervous tic she developed years ago, though I never understood why she hid her hand. I looked down at the new text message blinking against the harsh sunlight. "Grace, please do not come Thursday. Wyatt's parents are very formal, and they ask a lot of questions. I do not want to explain your contracting work to them. Your hands are always so scraped up. Let Caroline have a perfect holiday with her new family." The words stared back at me. She was not just declining my invitation to host, she was erasing my seat at her table. I was an embarrassment. My honest work, the very trade that kept a roof over my head, was a liability to her. She wanted to present a flawless high society facade to a future son-in-law who wore seersucker suits and traded commercial real estate. She was willing to cut her own daughter out of the family portrait just to keep the frame looking expensive. A hot, searing flush of rejection climbed my throat. I did not text back a measured response. I did not take a deep breath and accept the insult like a stoic hero. I lost my grip. I held a heavy steel measuring tape in my right hand. The raw sting of the text eclipsed my common sense. I hurled the metal block over the edge of the scaffolding. I watched the steel tape measure plummet 90 feet through the air. It struck the windshield of my own Ford truck parked on the street below. The safety glass fractured instantly, spiderwebbing into 1,000 glittering pieces that caved inward under the impact. I stood on the metal grating, my chest heaving, staring down at the ruined glass. If your mother told you your honest living was too embarrassing for a holiday table, would you fight for a seat or walk away forever? I climbed down the scaffolding ladder, my boots ringing against the rungs. I reached the street and pulled the driver's side door open, brushing the shattered glass off the leather seat. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Beatrice, uninvited, the dirty worker. She had no idea the dirty worker was holding the legal documents to the largest financial safety net our family had ever seen. The inheritance she assumed would secure her golden child's future was locked inside a trust, and my calloused, scraped-up hands held the only key. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, brushing shards of safety glass off my lap. The manila envelope rested heavy on the center console. My mother had just banished me from Thanksgiving because my existence clashed with her pristine narrative. She assumed I was nothing more than a blue-collar disappointment. She spent her days attending luncheons and obsessing over country club invitations, while I spent mine on scaffolding, restoring the crumbling 19th-century brick facades of historic Grant Park. My trade requires mixing lime and sand, lifting heavy materials, and enduring the humid Georgia climate. It is not glamorous, but it taught me how to spot a weak foundation beneath a fresh coat of paint. And the foundation of my family was rotting from the inside out. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. They were the finalized trust papers from the estate of my late Aunt Vivian. Vivian was my father's older sister. She passed away 2 months ago, leaving behind an estate nobody in the family knew she possessed. She lived quietly, driving a beat-up sedan and wearing clothes she bought at discount stores. Beatrice always looked down on her, treating her like an eccentric relative to be tolerated during the holidays. My mother and sister had no idea Vivian had quietly amassed a fortune in real estate and municipal bonds. They also had no idea she had named me the sole legal gatekeeper of that fortune. To understand why Vivian bypassed the polished socialites and handed the keys to the dirty worker, you have to go back 14 years. It was a sweltering July afternoon. The Georgia heat was oppressive, turning the air thick and stagnant. Vivian had invited us over for Sunday dinner. Beatrice and a teenage Caroline sat inside the air-conditioned living room, sipping sweet tea and complaining about the humidity ruining their hair. They refused to step outside. I was 18 years old. I wandered into the backyard and noticed the old brick patio was sinking. The ground had shifted, creating dangerous, uneven gaps. I saw Vivian trip over a loose brick earlier that afternoon, nearly twisting her ankle. While my mother and sister gossiped inside, I found a trowel in the gardening shed. I dug up the loose bricks, kneeling in the wet Georgia mud. I leveled the dirt, carried heavy bags of sand from the garage, and reset the pathway so the old woman would not fall again. I worked for 3 hours, sweating through my clothes, my fingernails caked with dark soil. I did not ask for praise. I did not expect to be paid. I just wanted to fix what was broken. Vivian came out to the back porch holding a glass of ice water. She did not offer me a towel or scold me for getting dirty. She stood there, watching me pack the dirt around the final brick. She told me I had a good head on my shoulders. She said people who are afraid of the dirt usually spend their whole lives trying to hide their own filth. She handed me the water and told me to never let anyone make me feel small for knowing how to build something real. Vivian saw the grit that day. She recognized that Beatrice was raising Caroline to be an ornamental fixture, dependent on the approval of wealthy men. She knew Caroline would never survive a real storm because she had never been taught how to brace for the wind. Vivian trusted the worker. She trusted the girl in the mud. That trust materialized in the pages resting on my lap. 3 days ago, I sat in a sleek law office in downtown Atlanta. The estate attorney was a stern man with silver hair who sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He handed me a sealed envelope along with the legal binders. It was a personal letter from Vivian. She wrote that wealth in the hands of the insecure is a weapon they will inevitably use against themselves. She knew Beatrice had raised Caroline to value appearance over substance. Vivian appointed me because I knew how to build a strong foundation. She charged me with protecting Caroline from her own vanity and from the predators who prey on naive women with deep pockets. The legal structure Vivian chose was ironclad. An irrevocable discretionary trust is a fortress. The attorney looked me in the eye and explained the gravity of my role. I was the sole trustee. I held absolute legally binding authority over every single dollar. I was not required to consult Caroline or Beatrice. I had the fiduciary duty to disperse the funds only if it served the beneficiary's best long-term interests. I had the power to withhold the money indefinitely if I deemed her reckless or compromised. Caroline owned the title to the wealth, but I held the vault. My sister was secretly drowning in debt, trying to fund a lavish lifestyle to impress her fiancé, Wyatt. Wyatt was a commercial real estate broker who spoke in buzzwords and drove leased luxury cars. Caroline needed this inheritance to salvage her sinking credit and pay for a wedding she could not afford. She was waiting for the probate court to formally unseal the documents next month, assuming she would receive a blank check. She had no idea the sister she mocked the sister, our mother just exiled from Thanksgiving, was the judge, jury, and executioner of her financial survival. My phone began to vibrate against the passenger seat, breaking my concentration. The screen lit up, displaying Caroline's name. I stared at the device. My sister had not called me in 3 weeks. She had not asked how my restoration business was doing. She never asked if my hands hurt after swinging a hammer for 10 hours a day. She only reached out when she needed to extract something from me. I let it ring. The call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, she called again. I watched the screen flash, listening to the dull hum of traffic on the street. A cynical, bitter resignation settled over my chest. I knew exactly why she was calling. The wedding planning was spiraling out of control. The phone rang a third time. I picked it up and swiped to open the voicemail she had just left. Her voice filled the cabin of my ruined truck, sounding frantic and breathless. "Grace," she pleaded, "you have to call me back. The florist is threatening to cancel the centerpieces for the bridal shower if I do not pay the deposit by tomorrow. Mom's credit card declined, and Wyatt is out of town on a golf trip. Can you please spot me $2,000? I promise I will pay you back as soon as Aunt Vivian's estate settles. Please, Grace, I am desperate. I cannot look cheap in front of Wyatt's friends." She was begging the blue-collar worker to fund her high society charade. On the very same day her mother banned me from the holiday table, she expected me to subsidize her floral arrangements. I held the phone in my bruised, scraped hand. I had the power to transfer the money with a single tap. I could have eased her panic. I could have been the supportive older sister rushing in to save the day. I deleted the voicemail. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned the key in the ignition. I did not text her back. I did not send the money. I let her sit in her manufactured crisis. A petty, spiteful satisfaction curled in my stomach. Let her sweat over the peonies. Let her panic over the declined credit cards. She treated me like a disposable cash machine while allowing her mother to treat me like an embarrassment. I was tired of absorbing their insults while quietly paying their tolls. How long could you sit on a $15 million secret while your family treats you like the hired help? How long could you watch them perform their elite pantomime, knowing you hold the power to drop the curtain at any given moment? I drove my damaged truck back to my house, the wind rushing through the shattered windshield. I felt a strange, cold clarity. I was not going to reveal my status as the trustee yet. I was going to let them play their parts. I was going to force myself to attend Caroline's upcoming bridal shower, enduring the hypocrisy and the whispered insults. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to observe Wyatt, the quintessential Southern gentleman whose parents were supposedly too refined to dine with a contractor. I suspected he was hiding something beneath his seersucker suits and monogrammed cuffs. The bridal shower would provide the perfect stage to test their loyalty. But what I would overhear at that party would prove that my future brother-in-law was not just a snob. He was a parasite, plotting to drain my family dry. I ignored Caroline's frantic voicemails about the floral deposit for 2 days. On the third day, I forced myself into a stiff linen dress I rarely wore and drove to the Swan Coach House in Buckhead. The Swan Coach House is a local institution synonymous with old Atlanta money. It is the kind of place where women wear large hats and pearls to lunch on chicken salad and tiny pimento cheese sandwiches cut into perfect, crustless triangles. The air inside the manicured gardens always felt heavy with unspoken social rankings and aggressive hospitality. It was the exact opposite of my world. I arrived 20 minutes late, intentionally missing the polite initial greetings. The private dining room was overflowing with pastel floral arrangements, monogrammed linen napkins, and Caroline's sorority sisters. Beatrice held court near the mimosa bar, looking frantic but immaculate. She shot me a warning glare as I walked in, a silent command to behave and blend in. I grabbed a mimosa from a passing waiter and retreated to a corner, clutching the stem of the flute. Wyatt was there. It is unusual for the groom to attend a bridal shower, but Wyatt rarely missed an opportunity to display his charm. He wore a crisp, light blue seersucker suit and a pair of expensive leather loafers. He moved through the room with the practiced ease of a commercial real estate broker, shaking hands and flashing a bright, practiced smile. He projected the image of a man who owned the room. But my trained eye noticed the subtle tension in his jaw. The smile never quite reached his eyes. He scanned the crowd, constantly assessing the value of every guest. I needed to know if Caroline's devotion to this man and his supposed high society status superseded her loyalty to her own blood. I needed to test the foundation before I made any decisions about the $15 million trust. I waited until the gift opening ceremony began. The bridesmaids clustered around Caroline, presenting her with silver serving trays, imported crystal decanters, and high-end espresso machines. When Caroline reached my gift wrapped in simple brown paper, I stepped closer. Inside the box was a handmade ceramic bowl. I bought it from a local artist I knew in Inman Park. It was beautiful, but imperfect, the glaze bearing the unique thumbprints of the potter. It was authentic. It was real. It was also undeniably inexpensive compared to the towering pile of luxury registry items. Caroline lifted the bowl out of the tissue paper. The room went quiet. A blonde bridesmaid standing to her left let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Oh, how rustic," she murmured, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Did you make that yourself, Grace? It looks like a high school art project." I looked at Caroline. This was her moment. She could defend me. She could accept the gift with genuine gratitude and shut down the snobbery. Instead, Caroline's face flushed a deep crimson. She looked at her future mother-in-law, then at the laughing bridesmaid. She chose the audience. "It is very earthy," Grace Caroline said, forcing a tight, awkward laugh. "I am sure I can find somewhere to put it. Maybe the laundry room or the garage." The bridesmaids erupted in giggles. Beatrice let out a sigh of relief, her social standing secure. A heavy, suffocating hypocrisy filled my lungs. I watched my sister sell me out for the approval of women who would drop her the second she stopped wearing designer labels. She sided with the elite snobs over the sister who had silently protected her. The rejection burned hotter than the shattered windshield of my truck. I retreated toward the French doors leading to the veranda, needing fresh air. I grabbed a second mimosa off a tray and drank it quickly, the cheap champagne hitting my empty stomach with a sharp, acidic burn. As I stepped onto the stone patio, I heard Wyatt's voice drifting from the adjoining alcove. He was standing near a marble fountain, smoking a cigar with one of his groomsmen. They did not see me in the shadows. "I am telling you, man, it is all about leveraging the timing," Wyatt said, taking a drag of his cigar. "The commercial market is a nightmare right now, but you have to know how to float the capital." The groomsman laughed, a nervous sound. "Are you sure you are not exposed, Wyatt? The feds are cracking down on those opportunity zone loopholes. You do not want the IRS looking too closely at your shell companies." Wyatt blew a cloud of smoke into the humid air, a smug, arrogant grin spreading across his face. "Relax," he chuckled. "The IRS only catches the uncreative. Besides, Caroline's crazy old aunt just kicked the bucket. We are unsealing the probate records next month. The girl is sitting on a massive trust payout. We are going to use the cash to buy our dream house outright. No mortgage, no paper trail. It will wash the balance sheet clean." I froze, the half-empty mimosa glass trembling in my hand. The dream house narrative felt hollow. Men who boast about evading the IRS and floating capital do not use cash to buy residential real estate simply to avoid high interest rates. They use cash to launder bad debt. They used liquid capital to hide assets from federal auditors. Wyatt was not planning to buy a home for my sister. He was planning to use Aunt Vivian's $15 million trust as a personal bailout fund to plug a massive sinking hole in his commercial real estate portfolio. He was marrying her for the bailout. And my sister, eager to escape her own hidden $80,000 credit card debt, was walking blindly into a trap set by a corporate parasite. When you realize your sister is marrying a parasite, do you warn the sister who just mocked you in front of a room full of strangers, or do you let her sink under the weight of her own vanity? My heart hammered against my ribs, fueled by adrenaline and the cheap champagne. I gripped the stem of the glass so tightly I thought the crystal would shatter. I stepped back from the alcove, retreating into the crowded dining room. The room spun slightly, the alcohol blurring the edges of the pastel floral arrangements. I saw Caroline laughing with the bridesmaid who insulted me. I saw Beatrice hovering near the door, ensuring no one stepped out of line. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to destroy the perfect facade. I wanted to scream the truth at the top of my lungs. I wanted to announce that I held the keys to the vault, and Wyatt was nothing but a broke con artist waiting for a handout. I took a step forward, but my heavy work boots caught the edge of an ornate silk table runner. I stumbled, pitching forward. My arms flailed wildly, attempting to break my fall. My hand caught the edge of a towering silver-tiered tray stacked high with expensive imported macarons. The metal tray crashed to the hardwood floor with a deafening clatter. Dozens of delicate pastel pastries scattered across the room, crushed beneath the heels of the startled guests. The dining room went dead silent. Every eye turned to me. I was lying on the floor, surrounded by ruined desserts, my linen dress stained with spilled mimosa. I looked up. Beatrice was staring at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. Caroline covered her mouth with her hand, mortified. I had just confirmed every terrible stereotype my mother held about me. I was the clumsy, unrefined, blue-collar embarrassment ruining the high society luncheon. I did not apologize. I scrambled to my feet, my face burning with a mix of fury and humiliation. I pushed past the glaring guests, bolted out the front doors of the Swan coach house, and practically ran to my truck. I slammed the door shut, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had made a fool of myself. I had given them the ammunition they needed to justify my exile from Thanksgiving. But as I sat in the cab of my truck, the shame began to morph into a cold, calculating anger. Wyatt thought he was going to use Vivian's trust to wash his balance sheet clean. He thought he was outsmarting the uncreative auditors. He had no idea the trustee was a forensic contractor who knew how to spot a crumbling foundation. I was not going to warn Caroline. She had made her choice at the gift table. Instead, I was going to investigate Wyatt's supposed dream house purchase. I was going to pull the municipal records and find out exactly what kind of rot he was trying to hide. But my investigation would not remain a secret for long. By officially denying his request for trust funds, I would accidentally reveal my identity to him, triggering a vicious bureaucratic retaliation that would threaten to choke the life out of my own business. I spent the weekend analyzing public real estate records. I cross-referenced the street address Wyatt had smugly mentioned to his groomsmen during the bridal shower. He claimed he was going to buy a dream house in cash to bypass high interest rates. It was a classic misdirection, designed to make Caroline believe he was providing for her future while masking his actual financial maneuvers. When I typed the address into the Fulton County Tax Assessor database, the screen displayed a glaring red error message. The property did not exist. There was no residential lot, no pending sale, no dream house. Wyatt was a commercial real estate broker. He dealt in high-yield, high-risk strip malls and office parks. I pulled the municipal filings for his LLCs and discovered a labyrinth of over-leveraged commercial mortgages. The truth emerged from the spreadsheets with terrifying clarity. He was facing a massive margin call on a failing commercial development in the suburbs. The lenders were demanding a $500,000 capital injection to cover the depreciating asset. If he failed to produce the cash, the bank would foreclose, triggering a domino effect that would wipe out his entire portfolio. He was not buying a house. He was plugging a catastrophic hole in his sinking ship. My initial plan was to stay hidden to observe his desperation from the shadows until the probate court unsealed Aunt Vivian's will. But Wyatt was too desperate to wait. On Monday morning, I received a certified letter at my contracting office. It was a formal request submitted by Wyatt's legal team, petitioning the estate for a $500,000 trust advance on Caroline's behalf. They cited urgent real estate acquisitions as the justification. As the sole trustee, I had the absolute legally binding authority to deny the request without explanation. I signed the denial form using a heavy black marker, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. I mailed it back within the hour. By formally rejecting the advance, I officially unmasked myself. The moment Wyatt received the denial, he would realize the dirty blue-collar sister he mocked was the iron gate standing between him and his $15 million bailout. I expected an angry phone call. I anticipated a screaming match where he would accuse me of jealousy. What I received instead was a masterclass in aggressive Southern manipulation. Wyatt showed up at my active restoration site in Grant Park the very next day. He did not look angry. He looked immaculate, wearing a crisp white dress shirt and a silver tie. He navigated the muddy, uneven ground of the construction zone with practiced ease, offering my crew members firm handshakes and wide, disarming smiles. He approached the scaffolding where I was mixing a fresh batch of lime mortar. "Grace," he called out, his voice dripping with forced charm. "It is so good to see you. Caroline told me how hard you work. I brought you a coffee." He held out an iced latte from a high-end Buckhead cafe. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron, ignoring the coffee. "Cut the act, Wyatt," I said, my voice flat. "You received the denial. I am the trustee. The trust is discretionary. I am not advancing $500,000 to cover your commercial margin call." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold, calculating predator underneath. He recovered quickly, leaning casually against a stack of bricks. "Now, Grace, let us not jump to conclusions," he murmured, adopting a tone of patronizing patience. "We are going to be family. Family helps family. The commercial market is a little tight right now, but it is a solid investment. If you release the advance, I can guarantee a substantial return for Caroline. You do not want to be the reason your sister loses out on securing her financial future, do you?" I picked up my masonry trowel, pointing the sharp metal tip directly at his chest. "Caroline's financial future is exactly what I am protecting. You are drowning in toxic debt, and you want to use her inheritance as a life raft. The answer is no. Now get off my job site before I have you cited for trespassing." Wyatt stared at the trowel, then up at my face. The charm evaporated, instantly replaced by a hard, venomous glare. "You are making a huge mistake, Grace," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. "You think because you hold the purse strings, you can dictate how the real world operates? You are just a laborer, playing with money you do not understand. In this city, it is not about what you hold, it is about who you know." He turned on his heel and walked back to his leased luxury SUV, leaving the iced coffee melting in the dirt. I watched him drive away, a cold knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. I knew he was dangerous, but I underestimated the reach of his influence. I thought my power as the trustee insulated me from his retaliation. I forgot that Atlanta operates on a deeply entrenched good old boy network where fraternity connections and golf course handshakes dictate the flow of business. 2 days later, my contracting company ground to a catastrophic halt. I arrived at my office at 6 a.m, preparing to dispatch my crews to 3 different historic restoration sites across the city. My foreman, a burly man named Dave, was standing by the dispatch board, looking pale and confused. "Grace," he said, holding up a stack of red tag notices, "we just got hit. The Atlanta Department of City Planning froze all our active scaffolding permits." They cited safety violations and improper historic zoning compliance. They ordered a complete work stoppage across all sites. I snatched the notices from Dave's hand, scanning the bureaucratic jargon. It was a complete fabrication. My company operated with pristine safety records and meticulous attention to historic guidelines. A city inspector had not set foot on our sites in weeks. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the stop work order. It belonged to a senior zoning official. I quickly searched the official's name on my phone. His social media profile featured a prominent photo of him standing on a golf course, smiling next to Wyatt. They were fraternity brothers. Wyatt was choking my livelihood. He used his municipal connections to illegally freeze my business. He knew my contracting company was my only source of personal income. I did not take a salary from the trust. If I could not work, I could not pay my crews, my suppliers, or my own mortgage. He was trying to starve me out, to force me into a corner where stepping down as trustee was my only option for survival. What do you do when the man trying to steal your family's money uses the local government to destroy your business? Do you surrender the trust to save your own skin, or do you fight a corrupt system stacked against you? A blinding, suffocating frustration seized my chest. I felt like a cornered animal. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the office, and drove recklessly toward downtown Atlanta. I parked illegally outside the municipal zoning building, marching through the glass doors with my pulse roaring in my ears. I bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her protests, and barged directly into the records department. I found a low-level clerk sitting behind a cluttered desk, entering data into a computer. I slammed the red-tagged stop work orders onto his keyboard, knocking over a cup of pens. "Who authorized this?" I yelled, my voice echoing sharply through the quiet municipal office. Other clerks stopped typing, turning their heads to stare at the commotion. "This is a fabricated violation. Wyatt put you up to this. You tell your boss that if he does not lift this freeze immediately, I will hire a team of corporate litigators to rip this department apart. I will expose his corrupt fraternity favors and ruin his career. Do you hear me?" The young clerk stared at me terrified, his eyes wide behind his thick glasses. "Ma'am," he stammered, shrinking back into his chair, "I do not know what you are talking about. I just processed the paperwork. You need to speak to the director." I stood there, chest heaving, my fists clenched at my sides. The adrenaline crashed, leaving me feeling exposed and foolish. I had just barged into a government office and threatened a terrified kid who had nothing to do with the corruption. I was acting exactly like the unhinged, hostile, blue-collar stereotype Wyatt wanted me to be. I was a bully, throwing a tantrum because I had lost control. I grabbed the stop work orders off the desk, my face burning with humiliation. I muttered a rough apology to the clerk and retreated from the building, avoiding the stares of the security guards. I sat in my truck in the parking garage, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. Wyatt had outmaneuvered me. He used the municipal machine to crush my business while he remained insulated from the fallout. I was losing ground rapidly. If I could not lift the permit freeze, I would lose my company within a month. I needed a strategy to fight back, but my mind was clouded by panic and exhaustion. I drove home, hoping to find a few hours of sleep to reset my racing thoughts. But the quiet sanctuary of my house would be shattered deep into the night by a phone call from the very woman who had exiled me. The midnight call would reveal a hidden, agonizing truth about my mother's financial desperation, forcing me to choose between my righteous anger and a profound, conflicted pity. I spent the rest of the week desperately calling every municipal contact I knew, trying to lift the freeze on my scaffolding permits. Wyatt's fraternity brother at the zoning office stonewalled me at every turn, citing arbitrary bureaucratic reviews that would take weeks to process. My business was bleeding cash. I had to furlough 2 of my masonry crews, unable to cover their hourly wages without active job sites. The anxiety gnawed at my stomach, a constant dull ache. I needed to apply pressure to Wyatt's foundation. If I could not fight him through the city, I had to destabilize his primary target. I knew Caroline was completely dependent on Beatrice for financial validation. My mother projected the image of a wealthy Buckhead socialite, but I knew her origins. Beatrice was born in Dahlonega, a small mountain town in the Appalachian foothills, defined by crushing generational poverty and a fierce, silent pride. She spent her entire adult life trying to scrub the red dirt of her childhood from her reputation, burying her past beneath a veneer of country club memberships and imported pearls. I decided to poke at her deepest insecurity. On Friday afternoon, I drove past her immaculate colonial-style home. I did not knock on the heavy oak door. I simply slipped a glossy, heavy cardstock brochure for a high-end boutique financial advisor into her wrought iron mailbox. The brochure specialized in debt consolidation and asset liquidation for distressed, high-net-worth families. It was a subtle, passive-aggressive jab designed to let her know I suspected her pristine financial facade was cracking. I returned to my quiet house in Inman Park, pouring a glass of cheap wine to numb the stress of my failing business. I fell asleep on the sofa, still wearing my dusty work clothes. At 2 a.m, my phone vibrated violently against the coffee table. The harsh mechanical buzz jolted me awake. I squinted at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Beatrice never called after 9 at night. She considered late-night phone calls a sign of poor breeding, a habit reserved for emergencies or the desperately undisciplined. I sat up, the residual sleep clearing from my mind instantly. I tapped the screen, accepting the call. "Hello," I said, my voice thick and cautious. A sharp, jagged intake of breath echoed through the receiver. "Grace," Beatrice whispered. Her voice was not the polished, melodic purr she used at charity luncheons. It was raw, stripped of all pretense, vibrating with a panicked vulnerability I had not heard since I was a child. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" "I saw the brochure you left in my mailbox," she choked out, a ragged sob breaking through her words. "Did you send it because you know? Do you know about the money?" "What money?" I asked, sitting up straight, the cold leather of the sofa biting through my shirt. She cried quietly for a long moment, the sound small and pathetic in the dark silence of my living room. "Caroline is drowning, Grace. She has $80,000 in hidden credit card debt. Wyatt expects a lavish lifestyle, and she has been charging everything: designer clothes, expensive dinners, even the deposits for this ridiculous wedding, just to keep up appearances. She thought Aunt Vivian's trust would settle it all, but now the probate court is delaying the distribution. The creditors are threatening to sue her. If Wyatt finds out, he will leave her." The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Caroline was not just vain. She was financially ruined, playing a dangerous game of pretend to secure a man who was playing the exact same game. They were two broke parasites trying to extract wealth from an empty host. "Why are you calling me at 2 a.m, I asked, my voice hardening as the memory of my Thanksgiving exile flared in my chest. "You told me my calloused hands were too embarrassing for your holiday table. Why are you calling the dirty worker for help?" "Because I have nothing left." Beatrice wept, the Appalachian drawl she spent decades suppressing, slipping back into her vowels. "I have been floating her debt for months. I paid the minimum balances to keep the collectors away, but my savings are gone." My mind raced, processing the staggering weight of her confession. My mother, who valued appearances above oxygen, was admitting to total financial failure. And then the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I remembered the text message she sent, exiling me from the holiday dinner. I remembered the nervous tick I pictured while she spoke, rubbing the bare ring finger on her left hand. "Your wedding ring," I whispered, the realization sending a chill down my spine. "The vintage diamond Dad bought you before he died. You stopped wearing it." "I pawned it," Beatrice sobbed, the admission tearing out of her like a physical wound. "I pawned my ring to a broker in Marietta to cover Carolyn's last billing cycle. I cannot get it back. The interest is too high. I have nothing left to sell, Grace. I am begging you. Can you please loan me $5,000 to cover this month's payments? I will pay you back, I swear it, on your father's grave." The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. The deep-rooted Appalachian pride, the unwritten rule that asking for money is a worse sin than starving, had been completely shattered. Beatrice had sacrificed her most prized possession, the only valuable anchor to her past, just to maintain her golden child's illusion. Would you bail out the mother who exiled you if you realized she was sacrificing everything for your sister? Would you hand her your hard-earned cash to feed the very machine that excluded you? I sat in the dark gripping the phone, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. I should have felt empathy. I should have recognized the profound, tragic sacrifice of a mother desperately trying to protect her child. Instead, the bitter sting of rejection, the memory of the smashed windshield and the frozen scaffolding permits, fueled a cruel, vindictive response. You pawned your wedding ring to pay for Caroline's shoes. I scoffed, my voice dripping with cold derision. You sold out your own history to impress a seersucker-wearing con artist. Where is all that Buckhead pride now, Mother? Where is the high society dignity when you are begging the blue-collar embarrassment for cash at 2 a.m? The sobbing on the other end of the line stopped instantly. A thick, heavy silence replaced the tears. I had struck a nerve buried so deep the pain paralyzed her. I am sorry to have bothered you, Grace Beatrice whispered, her voice turning to ash. The line went dead. The dial tone hummed a monotonous, flat sound in the dark. I lowered the phone, staring blankly at the glowing screen. The satisfaction I expected from my cruel retort never materialized. It was instantly swallowed by a crushing, suffocating wave of regret. I had just mocked a broken, terrified woman who had swallowed her last ounce of pride to beg for a lifeline. I acted like a bully, using my financial stability as a weapon to punish her for a lifetime of perceived slights. I was no better than Wyatt. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table, burying my face in my hands. The conflicted pity gnawed at my conscience, tearing me apart. I hated her for exiling me, but I understood the paralyzing terror of debt. I understood the desperate urge to protect family at any cost. I needed to fix my mistake. I needed to redeem her pawn ticket and get her ring back. I decided I would use the trust to quietly pay off Caroline's debt, bypassing Wyatt entirely. I thought I could manage the situation from the shadows, utilizing my power as the trustee to clean up the mess before the wedding. But Wyatt was not a man who waited in the shadows. He recognized that my business freeze had not broken my resolve. He realized my mother was tapped out. He needed the $15 million immediately to save his commercial empire, and he decided to launch a direct legal assault against me. By morning, a process server would arrive at my front door delivering a formal petition that would drag my own sister into the courtroom, forcing her to publicly betray me and igniting a brutal legal war I was entirely unprepared to fight. I woke up the next morning with a heavy, sour taste in my mouth, the memory of my cruel late-night phone call with Beatrice lingering like a bad hangover. The Georgia sun was already climbing high, painting the sky a harsh, brilliant blue. I dressed quickly, pulling on a clean pair of denim work pants and a faded flannel shirt. My masonry crews were still furloughed due to the illegal permit freeze Wyatt orchestrated, but I needed to maintain a routine. I drove my damaged Ford truck to a local diner, ordering a black coffee and preparing to execute a quiet rescue mission. I planned to visit the pawn shop in Marietta to retrieve my mother's wedding band, and then contact the estate lawyer to formally delay the trust disbursement. As the sole trustee, Georgia law required me to send the beneficiary a formal written notice if I intended to withhold funds past the expected probate date. I drafted the Notice of Delayed Distribution, citing administrative review as the primary reason, keeping the language clinical and vague. I did not mention Caroline's $80,000 credit card debt or Wyatt's commercial margin calls. I wanted to pause the clock, giving myself time to untangle the financial mess before releasing a single dime. I emailed the PDF document to Caroline's personal address, clicking send with a heavy sigh. I assumed the notice would buy me at least a month of breathing room. I underestimated Wyatt's desperation. He did not have a month. He needed the $15 million immediately to save his sinking commercial real estate portfolio from total ruin. He knew he possessed zero legal standing to challenge my authority as the trustee. He was just a fiancé, an outsider looking in. But he also knew the one person who held the legal right to challenge me was entirely dependent on his approval. At noon, I was sitting in the cab of my truck, parked outside the Marietta pawn shop, staring at the neon signs blinking in the strip mall window. A dark gray sedan pulled up beside me. A man in a cheap, wrinkled suit stepped out, holding a thick manila folder. He walked up to my driver's side window, tapping the glass. "Are you Grace?" he asked, his voice bored and mechanical. I rolled down the window, the humid air rushing into the cab. "Yes." He dropped the folder through the open window, letting it land heavily on my lap. "You have been served," he muttered, turning and walking back to his car without another word. I stared at the thick stack of paper, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the folder, sliding the documents out. The heading at the top of the first page was printed in bold, black ink. "In the probate court of Fulton County, state of Georgia, petition for the removal of trustee for breach of fiduciary duty." My eyes scanned the legal jargon, the dense paragraphs citing specific statutes of the Georgia Trust Code. I expected to see Wyatt's name listed as the petitioner, attempting some frivolous legal maneuver. Instead, the name printed on the signature line struck me with the force of a physical blow. The petitioner was Caroline. My sister was suing me. I read the allegations, my breath catching in my throat. Wyatt had manipulated the formal notice of delayed distribution I sent that morning, twisting the clinical language into evidence of malicious intent. He convinced Caroline that I was illegally hoarding her inheritance out of pure spite. The petition claimed I harbored deep-seated personal animus toward the beneficiary, citing my recent exile from the family Thanksgiving dinner as proof of my vindictive nature. The document alleged I was using my power as the trustee to punish Caroline for my own social shortcomings, demanding my immediate removal and the appointment of an independent corporate executor. A blinding, suffocating panic seized my chest. The austere wood-paneled courtrooms of the Fulton County Probate Court are steeped in rigid traditions and aggressive litigation. If a judge believed the allegations, I would be stripped of my authority. A corporate executor would step in, review the clean surface-level financials of Wyatt's commercial proposals, and authorize the release of the $15 million. Wyatt would successfully drain the trust, laundering his bad debt through my sister's inheritance, leaving her bankrupt the moment the ink dried. The betrayal cut deeper than the Thanksgiving exile. I was actively trying to protect Caroline from a financial predator, and she was dragging me into a brutal legal war to strip away the only shield keeping her safe. The cab of the truck suddenly felt incredibly small closing in around me. My lungs screamed for oxygen, but the humid air felt thick and unbreathable. The invincible forensic contractor, the woman who scaled 90-foot scaffolding without a safety harness, was drowning in a sea of legal paperwork. How do you legally prove you are protecting a trust fund when your own sister testifies under oath that you are acting out of pure jealousy? How do you defend your character when your family is willing to commit perjury to fund an illusion? I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. A wave of raw, helpless fury washed over me. I looked at the petition, the bold black letters mocking my attempts to save my family. I grabbed the thick stack of paper and tore it in half, the sound of ripping parchment loud in the quiet cab. I tore the halves again and again until my lap was covered in jagged, shredded pieces of legal threats. I wanted to destroy the reality of the lawsuit. I wanted to erase the betrayal. I sat there, shivering despite the heat, staring at the confetti of shredded paper. The adrenaline crashed, leaving me exhausted and thoroughly humiliated by my own childish outburst. I could not ignore a court summons. Destroying the physical paper did not erase the digital docket. I had to face the judge. I had to defend my position or watch Wyatt destroy my sister's life. With shaking hands, I began gathering the shredded pieces of the petition. I pulled a roll of clear packing tape from my glove compartment and spent the next 20 minutes meticulously taping the document back together, matching the jagged edges of my sister's signature. It was a pathetic, tedious task, a physical manifestation of my desperate need to hold the crumbling foundation of my family intact. I needed to stop the lawsuit before it reached a courtroom. I could not afford a lengthy public battle that would expose my business to further scrutiny or drain the trust fighting legal fees. I had to confront Caroline directly. I needed to force her to see the reality of the man she was fighting for. But the confrontation would not happen in a quiet, comfortable setting. I was going to drag the golden child out of Buckhead and into my world, forcing her to face the dirty, greasy reality of the city she tried to ignore. And the ensuing argument would result in a massive public scene, confirming every terrible stereotype Wyatt had convinced her to believe about me. The taped-together petition sat on the passenger seat of my truck, a jagged, fragile reminder of the ticking clock. I had 30 days to file a formal response with the Fulton County Probate Court or risk a default judgment stripping me of my trustee status. I could not afford to let the legal machinery grind forward. I needed to cut the strings Wyatt was pulling. I texted Caroline demanding a meeting. She agreed, but insisted on controlling the venue, suggesting an upscale bistro in Buckhead, where the lighting was dim and the prices were astronomical. I replied with a hard no. I chose the location. I texted her an address in downtown Atlanta and told her to be there at noon the following day. I chose the Varsity. It is a massive, sprawling fast food institution located right on the edge of the Georgia Tech campus. It is loud, crowded, and unapologetically greasy. The air inside always smells of deep-fried onion rings, chili dogs, and cheap motor oil from the adjacent highway. It is a place where construction workers, students, and tourists stand shoulder to shoulder. The cashiers shout their signature greeting, "What will you have?" over the chaotic din of the dining room. It was the absolute antithesis of the Swan Coach House. I wanted to drag the elite bride out of her air-conditioned bubble and force her to sit in the working-class reality she so deeply despised. I arrived early, securing a red vinyl booth near the massive glass windows overlooking the downtown connector. I wore my faded canvas work jacket, the elbows stained with dry mortar. I wanted Caroline to see the dirt she was trying to sue me over. At 12:15, the heavy glass doors swung open. Caroline walked in looking entirely out of place in a designer silk blouse and pristine white trousers. She scanned the crowded room, her nose wrinkling in visible distaste at the smell of frying grease. But she was not alone. Wyatt walked in right behind her. He wore a tailored light blue seersucker suit, the fabric crisp and immaculate against the chaotic backdrop of the fast food joint. He placed a possessive hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd toward my booth. He had invited himself. He was not going to let me speak to my sister alone. He needed to control the narrative, ensuring his carefully constructed lies remained intact. They slid into the red vinyl booth opposite me. Wyatt offered a tight, condescending smile, brushing a stray crumb off the table before resting his forearms on the formica surface. Caroline refused to look at me. She stared out the window, her posture rigid and defensive. "Why are we here?" Grace Caroline asked, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Could you not find a place that does not smell like a mechanic's garage?" I ignored the insult, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Why did you file the petition, Caroline?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. "You are suing your own sister. You are accusing me of acting out of personal malice because Mom uninvited me from a turkey dinner. Do you really believe I would hold back $15 million over a petty family squabble?" Caroline finally turned to look at me, her eyes blazing with a fierce, righteous indignation. "Yes," she snapped, her voice rising above the ambient noise of the restaurant. "You have always been jealous of me. You sit up on your scaffolding, covered in dirt, judging me and Mom for wanting nice things. You hate that I am marrying into a good family. You hate that Wyatt can provide a lifestyle you will never have. You are holding my inheritance hostage because you want to ruin my wedding out of pure blue-collar spite." The sheer audacity of her accusation stole the breath from my lungs. She was aggressively defending the very illusion that was currently bleeding her mother dry. She had no idea Beatrice had pawned her wedding ring to float her hidden credit card debt. She had no idea the man sitting next to her was facing a multi-million-dollar margin call. Wyatt jumped in, adopting the tone of a patient mediator dealing with a difficult child. "Now, Grace, let us be reasonable," he murmured, his voice smooth and practiced. "Caroline is just trying to secure her future. We understand you feel marginalized by the family dynamic, but using Aunt Vivian's trust as a weapon is not the answer. If you step down voluntarily, we can avoid a messy public trial. We can keep this quiet and protect your contracting business from any further municipal scrutiny." The veiled threat regarding my frozen scaffolding permits hung in the greasy air. He was reminding me that he controlled the zoning office. He was offering a trade, my livelihood, for her inheritance. I turned my focus back to Caroline, ignoring the parasite sitting beside her. "He is lying to you," I said, my voice dropping to a desperate, urgent whisper. "The dream house he promised you does not exist. I checked the municipal records. He is not buying residential real estate. He is drowning in commercial debt. His homestead development is failing, and he is using your trust payout as a personal bailout fund to save his own skin. If you remove me as trustee, he will drain that account and leave you with nothing." Have you ever tried to save someone who aggressively fights for the right to be ruined? Have you ever thrown a lifeline to a drowning person, only to have them slap your hand away because they prefer the color of the water? Caroline let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Her eyes narrowed, filled with a cold, unyielding contempt. "You are pathetic, Grace," she sneered. "You cannot stand the fact that he is successful. You made up some ridiculous story about commercial debt because you cannot comprehend how real money operates. You think everyone is a scam artist just because you work for an hourly wage. You are just a laborer, playing games with wealth you will never understand. I want my money, and I want you out of my life." The insult hit its mark, striking the deep-seated insecurity I had carried since childhood. I spent my life trying to prove my worth through honest, grueling labor, and my own sister was looking at me like I was a smear of dirt on her pristine white trousers. She was willfully, blindly plunging a knife into the only shield keeping her safe. The strategic calm I had planned evaporated. The righteous indignation, the exhausting fight to protect a family that actively despised me, boiled over into a sudden, explosive rage. I did not deliver a cool, calculated retort. I lost my temper entirely. I grabbed the red plastic basket of greasy French fries sitting on the table between us. I stood up, leaning over the booth, and hurled the basket directly at Wyatt's chest. The greasy fries and ketchup splattered across the front of his immaculate tailored seersucker suit, staining the crisp fabric with bright red streaks and dark oil spots. Wyatt gasped, jumping backward out of the booth, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. Caroline shrieked, covering her mouth in shock. The entire dining room of the Varsity went dead silent. Dozens of patrons turned to stare at the commotion, the cashier's shouts fading into the background. "You want your money?" I yelled, my voice raw and echoing across the restaurant. "Then you are going to have to fight me in court for every single dime. I am going to bury your fake husband in so much forensic evidence, he will wish he never heard the name Vivian." I turned and marched out of the restaurant, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. I had just physically assaulted my future brother-in-law with fast food, causing a massive public scene, and confirming every unhinged stereotype he had fed to my sister. I had handed him the perfect narrative for his probate petition. But as I sat in my truck, my hands shaking with adrenaline, the anger began to crystallize into a cold, sharp clarity. If Wyatt wanted a legal war, I was going to give him one. I was not going to rely on zoning permits or family loyalties anymore. I was going to pivot my gritty work ethic away from the scaffolding and direct it entirely toward his financial records. I was going to hire a forensic accountant to audit his LLCs, and I was going to excavate the truth buried beneath his tailored suits. But the paper trail I was about to uncover would reveal a crime far more severe than a commercial margin call, pushing the conflict out of civil probate court and directly into the crosshairs of federal law enforcement. The disaster at the Varsity cemented my reputation as the hostile, unstable sister holding the family wealth hostage. Wyatt had the perfect narrative for his probate petition. He could stand before a judge, point to my greasy outburst, and argue that I was unfit to manage a $15 million trust. I needed to shift the battlefield. I could not win a popularity contest against the Golden Child, but I could win a war of attrition. The first step was securing time. I submitted a formal request to the Fulton County Probate Court asking for a 30-day extension to file my response to Caroline's petition. I drafted the request carefully, adopting a tone of overwhelmed incompetence. I cited the sudden, unexpected freeze on my business permits, claiming the administrative burden of managing my contracting company left me unable to adequately prepare my legal defense. I played directly into Wyatt's ego. I wanted him to believe his municipal sabotage had successfully crushed my spirit. The judge granted the extension, pushing the initial mediation hearing to late October. Wyatt took the bait. He assumed I was drowning in red tape, paralyzed by the stop work orders. He did not realize the extension was a smokescreen. With my job sites forcibly shut down, I no longer had to spend my days mixing mortar or climbing scaffolding. I had 70 hours a week of newly available time, and I pivoted my gritty, relentless work ethic entirely toward excavating his financial history. I hired an independent forensic accountant, a sharp, quiet woman named Sarah, who specialized in unraveling corporate fraud. We turned the screened-in porch of my Inman Park house into a war room. The Georgia heat still clung stubbornly to the autumn air. We spent late nights sitting under the slow rotation of the ceiling fan, drinking overly sweet iced tea, swatting away the persistent hum of mosquitoes. The porch was littered with bankers' boxes filled with subpoenaed bank records, public municipal filings, and property tax assessments. For 2 weeks, we pulled the thread on Wyatt's various LLCs, mapping the complex web of his commercial real estate empire. The initial surface-level documents portrayed a successful broker managing a robust portfolio. Tracing the flow of capital between his holding companies, the polished facade began to crumble. Wyatt was not just a bad businessman struggling with a tough market. The paper trail revealed a calculated pattern of predatory behavior. We found the margin call documents for the failing homestead project, but the rot went much deeper. He had actively defrauded previous investors, falsifying project valuations to secure secondary loans. He was running a sophisticated shell game, moving cash from new investors to pay off the old ones, creating the illusion of liquidity while the underlying assets bled out into the swamp. But the most devastating discovery arrived on a humid Tuesday night. Sarah slid a printed document across the wicker table, tapping a specific line item with her pen. "Look at the Federal Registry," she said, her voice quiet and clinical. "He has been dodging the Internal Revenue Service for 3 years. He is hiding massive federal tax liens." I picked up the paper, scanning the dense columns of numbers. The total amount owed to the federal government exceeded $2 million. The IRS was already actively circling his shell companies, preparing to seize his remaining assets to satisfy the debt. The cold clarity washed over me, chilling the muggy night air. Wyatt was not just facing civil bankruptcy. He was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for tax evasion and investor fraud. If the IRS executed those liens, he would lose everything and likely face a significant prison sentence. The $15 million trust was not just a bailout fund to save his commercial properties. It was his only viable escape hatch from federal prison. He needed Caroline's inheritance to wash his balance sheet clean and pay off the government before the indictment came down. When you find the weapon that will destroy your enemy, do you fire it immediately, or do you wait for maximum damage? Do you show your hand early to secure a quick victory, or do you let them walk blindly into a trap from which they can never return? I stared at the federal tax lien, the black ink searing the truth into my mind. I could have emailed the document to Caroline right then, exposing his fraud and blowing up the wedding. But my sister had stood in a greasy fast food restaurant and looked at me with absolute contempt, defending the man who was actively plotting to steal her future. I realized that presenting her with the evidence privately would not work. Wyatt would simply spin a lie, claiming the liens were a misunderstanding or a clerical error, and Caroline, desperate to maintain her Buckhead illusion, would believe him. I needed to spring the trap in a setting where he could not lie. I needed to wait for the court-ordered probate mediation. I would let him sit across the table smug and confident, and I would let him perjure himself on the record before dropping the federal guillotine. The decision was strategic and cold, but the isolation required to execute it began to wear on my nerves. The long nights on the porch surrounded by evidence of betrayal left me feeling hollow. I had the power to destroy him, but I had never felt more alone. My mother was pawning her jewelry, my sister was suing me, and I was spending my evenings hunting ghosts in financial spreadsheets. At 1 a.m. after Sarah left for the night, I sat on the porch, staring out into the dark yard. The quiet of the house was oppressive. A wave of profound, lonely exhaustion washed over me. I wanted someone to tell me I was doing the right thing. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, stopping on the name of my ex-boyfriend, a man I had pushed away 2 years ago because my contracting business consumed all my time. I tapped the call button, the bourbon I drank earlier clouding my judgment. The phone rang 4 times before the automated voicemail clicked on. "Hey," I slurred my voice, thick and embarrassing. "I know it is late. I really messed everything up with my family. They hate me. I found all this evidence and I am going to ruin my sister's wedding. I just wanted to hear your voice. I am so tired of fighting alone." I hung up the phone instantly, regretting the pathetic, vulnerable message. I tossed the device onto the wicker table, burying my face in my hands. The invincible trustee, the forensic investigator, had just left a pathetic, crying voicemail for a man who had long moved on. I was clinging to the past because the present was too painful to navigate. I forced myself to stand up, ignoring the heavy weight of my exhaustion. The self-pity had to end. The mediation hearing was scheduled for the following week. I needed to prepare for the final confrontation. But what I anticipated to be a straightforward legal execution would be derailed by a shocking, unexpected defense from the very woman who had exiled me. The mediation room was about to become a battlefield, and the allegiance of my mother would throw my entire calculated strategy into absolute chaos. The morning of the probate mediation arrived with a crisp, sudden chill cutting through the lingering autumn humidity. The mandatory session was scheduled at a high-end alternative dispute resolution firm in Midtown Atlanta. The offices were located on the 40th floor of a sleek glass tower, projecting an aura of intimidating corporate authority. I deliberately chose my wardrobe to clash with the environment. I did not wear a tailored suit or a polished blazer. I wore a faded Carhartt jacket, a plain cotton shirt, and my scuffed leather work boots, still carrying traces of dried mortar. I wanted Wyatt to see the unrefined laborer he despised. I wanted his arrogance to blind him to the lethal financial trap I was carrying in the worn leather folio tucked under my arm. I stepped out of the elevator and into the reception area. The air smelled of expensive espresso and polished mahogany. A receptionist offered me a glass of sweet tea with the stiff, aggressive politeness native to Southern legal proceedings, where lawyers smile brightly while actively plotting to bankrupt you. I declined the tea and walked into the designated conference room. Wyatt and Caroline were already seated on one side of a long glass table, flanked by 2 slick attorneys wearing immaculate suits. Beatrice sat slightly behind them, twisting the strap of her designer handbag, her face pale and drawn. Wyatt looked up as I entered, his eyes dropping to my scuffed boots. A smug, victorious smirk crossed his face. He nudged his lead attorney, gesturing subtly to my attire. He thought my appearance was an admission of defeat, a sign that the municipal freeze on my business had broken my spirit. A mediator, an older gentleman with silver hair and a soothing, measured voice, took his seat at the head of the table. He initiated the proceedings, outlining the purpose of the session to resolve the dispute over the $15 million trust before it reached a public trial. Wyatt's lead attorney began the opening statement, painting a vivid, entirely fabricated picture of my character. He described me as a hostile, uncooperative trustee harboring deep-seated personal animosity toward my sister. He brought up the incident at the Varsity, spinning my angry outburst as evidence of a volatile temperament unfit for managing massive wealth. Wyatt nodded along, leaning back in his expensive chair, looking like a man who had already won the war. The dramatic irony was heavy and suffocating in the quiet room. Wyatt sat there spinning lies about my competence, while I sat across from him, holding the audited proof of his massive federal tax liens and fraudulent LLCs, resting quietly in the leather folio on my lap. He was a sinking ship, boasting about his buoyancy to the person holding the torpedo. The mediator turned to me, his expression neutral. "Miss Grace, do you have a response to these allegations?" Before I could open my mouth to speak, a voice from the back of the room cut through the tense silence. "She is not volatile," Beatrice said, her voice sharp and surprisingly steady. Every head in the room turned to look at my mother. Caroline gasped, turning in her chair. "Mom, what are you doing?" Beatrice stood up, stepping forward to the edge of the glass table. She looked directly at Wyatt, her gaze hard and unforgiving. "Grace is not an unstable woman," she continued, the polished Buckhead accent dropping away to reveal the raw Appalachian grit underneath. "She works 70 hours a week, covered in dirt, to build a business from the ground up. She is stubborn and she is angry, but she has more integrity in her dirty boots than half the men sitting in this room. If she is withholding the trust money, she is doing it for a reason. She knows how to protect a foundation." The silence that followed was absolute. The slick attorneys stared at Beatrice in shock. Wyatt's smug smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. My mother, the woman who had exiled me from Thanksgiving because my hands were an embarrassment, was publicly defending my character in front of the very people she used to try to impress. It was the validation I had starved for my entire life, delivered in a corporate boardroom. If your abuser finally stands up for you in public, is it enough to erase decades of mistreatment? Can a single moment of courageous honesty wash away the bitter legacy of 1,000 quiet rejections? I looked at my mother, the woman who pawned her wedding ring to fund a lie, standing tall to defend my truth. My heart hammered against my ribs, a confusing mix of validation and profound aching grief threatening to choke me. I should have thanked her. I should have accepted the olive branch and allowed the moment to heal the fracture between us. Instead, the resentment I had harbored for 32 years flared up hot and defensive. I looked away from her, staring down at the glass table. 20 years too late, Mother, I scoffed, my voice dripping with cold, cynical resentment. Keep your character witness. I do not need it. Beatrice flinched as if I had struck her physically, stepping back from the table and sinking into her chair. The rejection landed perfectly, maintaining the heavy wall I had built between us. I was still deeply flawed, clinging to my anger, because the anger was easier to navigate than forgiveness. The mediator cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room. "Miss Grace," he asked again cautiously, "do you intend to step down as trustee?" I placed my hands flat on the table, looking directly at Wyatt. I did not open the leather folio. I did not reveal the federal tax liens or the proof of his investor fraud. The forensic accountant in me knew that simply exposing him would trigger an immediate criminal investigation, freezing the trust assets entirely and tying the money up in federal court for years. Caroline would still be broke, and I would be stuck managing the legal fallout. I needed a cleaner, more surgical execution. "I will not step down," I said, my voice projecting a calculated, calm restraint. "But I am willing to exercise my absolute discretionary power to resolve this conflict today." Wyatt scoffed, leaning forward. "You are not resolving anything. You are just stalling." "I am proposing an investment," I countered, interrupting him. "As the trustee, I am legally permitted to invest the trust capital if it serves the long-term financial interests of the beneficiary. Wyatt, you claim your commercial real estate developments are highly lucrative. You claim you just need liquid capital to finalize a massive acquisition." Wyatt narrowed his eyes, suspicious of the sudden shift in tone. "That is correct," he said cautiously. "Then the trust will provide the capital," I announced, the words hanging heavy in the chilled air. "I am willing to authorize a direct transfer of funds to your holding company, but not as an unearned advance. The trust will legally purchase your outstanding commercial debt, acting as your new primary creditor. We will buy the notes your private equity lenders are currently holding. The trust will secure Caroline's future by tying the capital directly to your supposedly booming business. The room went dead quiet. Wyatt's lead attorney frowned, leaning over to whisper furiously into Wyatt's ear. They were confused. On the surface, I was offering exactly what Wyatt wanted. I was handing him millions of dollars from the trust to clear his margin calls. But by structuring the transfer as a debt acquisition, I was completely altering the power dynamic. Wyatt stared at me, his mind racing, trying to find the hidden trap. He assumed I was a dumb blue-collar laborer finally folding under the pressure. He thought I was handing him the keys to the kingdom. He had no idea the crown I was offering him was rigged with explosives. I was going to use my sister's inheritance to buy the chains currently wrapped around his neck, and when he inevitably failed to pay the trust back, I would have the legal authority to foreclose on his entire existence. But before I could snap the trap shut, Caroline would uncover a horrifying secret on her own, forcing a confrontation that would shatter her fairy tale life and drive her straight into my arms. The mediation session ended with Wyatt's attorneys scrambling to review the terms of the debt acquisition. They assumed I was an amateur, making a desperate, reckless move to protect my sister's cash flow. I left the glass tower in Midtown feeling a grim, tense satisfaction. The trap was set, but I needed the jaws to snap shut before Wyatt could finalize the paperwork. I needed Caroline to wake up. I could not just tell her the truth. She had already proven she would aggressively defend her fiancé against my warnings. She needed to discover the rot on her own. I returned to my porch the same afternoon, pulling a single, heavily redacted copy of Wyatt's federal tax liens from a banker's box. I slipped the document into a plain manila envelope. I did not include a note or a return address. I drove to the post office and mailed it directly to the upscale bridal boutique in Buckhead, where Caroline spent her afternoons agonizing over expensive lace fittings. I knew the arrival of an anonymous tax document would trigger her latent anxiety. I counted on her vanity to compel her to investigate. The fallout occurred 48 hours later. I received a frantic text message from Caroline begging me to meet her in Savannah. She had fled Atlanta, desperate to escape the suffocating gossip mill and the watchful eyes of Wyatt's social circle. I drove the 4 hours down the interstate, the humid Georgia air thickening as I approached the coast. I found her sitting on a wrought iron bench in Forsyth Park. The massive, ancient oak trees draped in heavy, dripping Spanish moss cast long, twisting shadows across the manicured grass. The grand fountain at the center of the park provided a steady, rushing soundtrack, muting the noise of the surrounding historic district. Caroline looked completely shattered. She was not wearing her designer sunglasses or her polished silk blouses. She wore a faded collegiate sweatshirt and a pair of running shoes, holding a thick stack of printed papers in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the documents. I sat down on the bench beside her, keeping a deliberate physical distance. I did not reach out to comfort her. I waited for her to speak. "You sent the tax document to the boutique," she whispered, her voice hollow, stripped of its usual melodic entitlement. I did not deny it. I just looked at the fountain. It made me paranoid. Caroline continued, taking a ragged breath. "I thought maybe he just made a mistake with his business taxes. I thought it was a corporate issue, but I got scared. Mom told me she pawned her ring because I maxed out my credit cards. I knew I spent a lot on the wedding, but $80,000 did not make sense. I have not bought that much. So I ran a full credit check on myself this morning." She turned to look at me, the horror and devastation written plainly across her pale face. He opened them. "Grace," she choked out a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. "Wyatt used my social security number. He forged my signature. He opened 5 different high-limit credit lines in my name over the last 6 months. He maxed them out to float his commercial real estate loans. He committed identity theft. The debt is not from my shopping. It is his debt, and I am legally on the hook for all of it." The revelation hit me with a cold, sickening thud. The forensic accountant in me had missed the identity theft. I was so focused on his LLCs and corporate fraud, I had failed to see the domestic abuse happening right under my nose. Wyatt did not just lie about his wealth. He actively preyed on his fiancée using her pristine credit score as a personal piggy bank, while he waited for her aunt to die so he could access the $15 million trust. "He never loved me," Caroline wailed, dropping the printed credit reports onto the ground, burying her face in her hands. "He only proposed because he knew Aunt Vivian was sick and he knew the trust was coming. He built this entire fairy tale just to steal from me. My whole life is a lie." How do you comfort a sibling when their entire fairy tale life was built on a calculated financial scam? How do you support a sister who mocked your honest labor while blindly marching into a trap set by a corporate parasite? I should have hugged her. I should have wrapped my arms around her shaking shoulders and promised her we would fix it. I should have been the protective older sister offering unconditional sanctuary. But the resentment I harbored for the Thanksgiving exile, the anger over the varsity confrontation, and the years of swallowing her snobbish insults blocked my empathy. The rough, calloused contractor took control. "I told you so," I said, my voice flat and unsympathetic, lacking even a shred of basic compassion. "I sat in a greasy diner and begged you to see the truth. I told you he was drowning in commercial debt and using your inheritance as a bailout. And you looked at me like I was garbage. You told me I was a jealous, blue-collar spinster playing games with wealth I did not understand. You chose the illusion over your own blood, and this is the price you pay for the ticket." Caroline flinched, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing harder. She did not argue. She knew I was right, and the brutal delivery of my truth crushed whatever fragile hope she had left. I sat on the bench under the dripping Spanish moss, watching my sister break into a million pieces. The petty, vindictive satisfaction I expected to feel never arrived. It was instantly replaced by a heavy, bitter guilt. I had just kicked a woman who was bleeding out on the ground. I was acting like a bully, using my foresight as a weapon to punish her for her naivete. "Pick up the papers," I sighed, rubbing my temples, the coastal humidity suddenly feeling oppressive. "We are going back to Atlanta. You are going to stay at my house until we figure out how to untangle your name from his accounts. Do not call him. Do not text him. Let him think the mediation settlement is moving forward." Caroline scrambled to gather the scattered credit reports, nodding mutely, her spirit utterly defeated. The golden child illusion was dead. The Buckhead facade had burned to the ground, leaving her exposed to the terrifying reality of federal fraud and identity theft. We drove back to Atlanta in total silence, the highway stretching out before us like a dark ribbon. I had successfully separated my sister from the parasite. The jaws of the financial trap were primed and ready to snap shut on Wyatt's neck. But before I could execute the final legal maneuver to buy his debt and initiate his ruin, my mother would arrive at my construction site unannounced, delivering a confession that would force me to reevaluate the entire history of our fractured family and confront the devastating truth behind my holiday exile. I established a temporary command center in my home office, securing Caroline in the guest bedroom and confiscating her phone to ensure absolute radio silence. The immediate threat of Wyatt's identity theft required a swift, clinical response. I hired a specialized consumer protection attorney to freeze her Social Security number and begin the arduous process of untangling her name from his fraudulent credit lines. But Caroline's financial ruin was merely the symptom. The disease was the toxic obsession with elite status that my mother had cultivated for decades. Beatrice's midnight confession regarding her pawned wedding band haunted me. The raw desperation in her voice, the heavy Appalachian drawl slipping past her polished Buckhead facade, gnawed at my conscience. I could not forget the image of her rubbing her bare left ring finger during the bridal shower. I had mocked her poverty, but the forensic accountant in me demanded a clean ledger. I drove to the pawn shop in Marietta the following morning. I paid the exorbitant interest fees, redeeming the ticket and retrieving the heavy vintage diamond ring my father bought her before he died. I drove to her immaculate colonial-style home. I did not knock on the heavy oak door. I placed the small velvet box containing the ring on the welcome mat and walked away. It was a silent transaction, settling a moral debt I felt I owed her for publicly defending me during the probate mediation. I assumed the gesture would close the chapter between us. I did not anticipate that the return of the ring would force a confrontation I was entirely unprepared to handle. 2 days later, my scaffolding permits were miraculously unfrozen. Wyatt, believing he had won the mediation and secured the trust capital, pulled his municipal strings to lift the stop work orders. I dispatched my crews, immediately returning to the historic Grant Park restoration site myself. I needed the physical labor to burn off the anxious adrenaline pumping through my veins. I stood on the ground level mixing a fresh batch of lime mortar, the familiar grit of the red clay coating my hands. The physical exertion grounded me, connecting me to the tangible reality of my trade. The roar of the cement mixer masked the sound of approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across my workstation. I looked up, wiping a streak of sweat from my forehead. Beatrice stood on the cracked sidewalk. She was not wearing her signature pearls or a tailored blazer. She wore a simple dark sweater and jeans, looking strikingly out of place against the backdrop of dust and scaffolding. The stark contrast between the manicured lawns of Buckhead and the messy reality of an active construction site seemed to amplify her vulnerability. She held out her left hand. The vintage diamond ring glinted in the harsh afternoon sun. "You got it back," she said, her voice quiet, trembling slightly. "Thank you, Grace." I picked up my masonry trowel, turning back to the mortar tub. "I did not do it for you, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone flat and defensive. "I did it because I was tired of watching you sacrifice your own history to impress a con artist. Caroline knows everything. She is staying with me. Wyatt stole her identity and ruined her credit. The wedding is over." Beatrice flinched, her shoulders slumping as the final illusion of her golden child's fairy tale collapsed. She did not defend Wyatt. She did not argue. She took a hesitant step closer to the mortar tub, ignoring the dust settling on her expensive shoes. "I know you hate me, Grace," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know you think I exiled you from Thanksgiving because I am ashamed of you, because you work in the dirt and wear heavy boots." I gripped the handle of the trowel, my knuckles turning white. "I think you uninvited me because my calloused hands do not fit into your perfect high society portrait." I snapped, the resentment flaring hot in my chest. "You wanted a pristine table for Wyatt's elite parents, and the dirty laborer was a liability." Beatrice shook her head, a single tear escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. "No," she sobbed, the polished Buckhead accent vanishing entirely, replaced by the raw, guttural cadence of the Appalachian foothills. "That is not true. I did not uninvite you because I was ashamed of you. I uninvited you because I was terrified of them." I froze the trowel, hovering over the wet mortar. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice wrapped her arms around her stomach, a gesture of profound defensive pain. "Do you know what it is like to grow up with nothing?" she cried, her voice rising over the noise of the street traffic. "I grew up in Dahlonega in a house with a dirt floor. We had nothing. The girls from Atlanta used to visit the mountains in the summer, and they looked at us like we were animals. They mocked my clothes. They mocked my accent. They made me feel so small I wanted to die. I promised myself I would never let my daughters feel that kind of humiliation." She took a ragged breath, pointing a trembling finger toward the Buckhead skyline. "I met Wyatt's parents at a charity gala 3 weeks ago. They asked about my family. When I mentioned your restoration business, his mother laughed. She laughed, Grace. She called you a glorified bricklayer. She asked if you were going to show up to the wedding, smelling like wet cement." I saw the look in her eyes. It was the exact same look those rich girls gave me when I was a child. The revelation hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving me gasping. "I could not let them do that to you." Beatrice wept, stepping closer, her hands reaching out as if to touch me, before pulling back. I knew you would not back down. I knew you would show up to that dinner in your boots, and they would tear you apart with their polite little smiles and their whispered insults. I could not watch them break you the way they broke me. So I pushed you away. I played the snob because I thought it was better for you to hate me than for them to humiliate you. I exiled you to protect you. Can a mother's cruelty ever be justified if it was born from a desperate attempt to shield you from elite snobbery? Can you forgive a wound if you realize the blade was intended to act as a shield? The profound grief of her confession shattered the rigid defensive walls I had built around my heart. I stared at my mother, seeing past the pearls and the country club memberships to the terrified, impoverished girl from Dahlonega, desperately trying to outrun her own shadow. Her trauma was messy and deeply flawed, resulting in decades of toxic behavior. She had manipulated and controlled us, but the root of her actions was not pure malice. It was a twisted, desperate form of maternal protection. The realization was agonizing. I wanted the narrative to remain simple. I wanted her to be the shallow villain and me to be the righteous victim. Accepting her flawed humanity required a level of emotional processing I was entirely unprepared to handle. The conflicting emotions boiled over into a sudden, violent outburst. I dropped the trowel into the mortar tub. I grabbed a heavy steel masonry hammer from my tool belt and turned toward a stack of discarded bricks. I swung the hammer with all my strength, bringing it down on the top brick. The clay shattered with a deafening crack, sending red dust exploding into the humid air. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure grief and frustration, hitting the ruined brick again and again, unable to articulate the massive, overwhelming weight of my mother's confession. "Stop," Beatrice cried, covering her mouth with her hands, stepping back from the flying debris. "Grace, please." I dropped the hammer, the heavy steel clattering against the pavement. I leaned against the scaffolding, my chest heaving, gasping for breath. The red dust coated my face, mixing with my own hot tears. "You do not protect people by locking them out," I yelled, my voice raw and echoing down the street. "You do not shield me from snobs by acting like one yourself. You let me believe for 32 years that I was not good enough for your table. You cannot fix that with an apology and a story about Dahlonega." I wiped my face with the back of my dirty sleeve. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, exhausted whisper. "But I am still not coming to Thanksgiving." Beatrice nodded, slowly accepting the boundary. She understood that a single confession could not erase decades of toxic conditioning. She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped, disappearing into the busy Atlanta traffic. I stood alone in the red dirt, the profound grief settling heavily into my bones. The emotional battlefield was littered with casualties, but the financial war still demanded a final, brutal execution. I had to pivot my focus back to Wyatt, executing a surgical strike that would bind him to the very family he tried to destroy, setting a trap so intricate and devastating he would not realize he was captured until the cage snapped shut. The confrontation with Beatrice left me emotionally hollowed out, but it also cleared the residual fog of familial obligation. I no longer questioned if my retaliation was too severe. My mother's twisted attempt at protection and my sister's terrifying encounter with identity theft proved that Wyatt was a cancer actively consuming my family. He needed to be excised with surgical precision. The strategy I proposed during the probate mediation, the offer to use the trust capital to invest in his commercial real estate holding company, was a calculated diversion. I knew Wyatt and his attorneys would assume I intended to provide a direct cash injection. They believed I was yielding to the pressure, acting as a novice trustee, desperate to resolve the conflict and secure Caroline's financial future. They spent the days following the mediation drafting settlement agreements, detailing the transfer of funds directly into his failing LLCs. I ignored their drafts. Instead, I met secretly with the estate lawyer who managed Aunt Vivian's affairs. Under the Georgia Trust Code, an irrevocable discretionary trust grants the trustee the absolute authority to invest the principal capital in diverse assets, provided the investment serves the long-term fiduciary interests of the beneficiary. The language is broad and terrifyingly powerful. I instructed the estate lawyer to bypass Wyatt entirely and contact the primary lending institution holding the toxic commercial mortgages on his homestead development. The bank was desperate to offload the non-performing loans. Wyatt had already missed 2 margin calls, and the property was bleeding cash. We negotiated a deeply discounted cash buyout using the $15 million trust capital to legally purchase the entirety of Wyatt's defaulted commercial debt. The transaction was complex, requiring layers of indemnification clauses and rapid-fire municipal filings. But when the dust settled, the legal reality was absolute. I did not step down as trustee. I did not hand Wyatt a single dime of Caroline's inheritance. Instead, the trust, acting under my sole discretion, now literally owned Wyatt. He was financially indentured to the very sister-in-law he tried to starve out using illegal zoning freezes, and the fiancé he defrauded with stolen credit lines. To execute the final phase, I needed to keep Wyatt complacent. I needed his ego to blind him to the shifting ground beneath his feet. I called his lead attorney and faked total defeat. I let my voice tremble, adopting the tone of an exhausted blue-collar worker breaking under the pressure of corporate litigation. I told him the municipal freeze had ruined my contracting business, and I could no longer sustain the fight. I agreed to sign the final settlement paperwork authorizing the transfer of funds at Wyatt's office the following week. The bait was irresistible. Wyatt's arrogance demanded a public surrender on his own turf. The morning of the scheduled signing arrived, draped in the dense, humid air typical of late November in Georgia, where the summer heat still lingers, stubbornly refusing to surrender to the impending holidays. I sat in my home office, the digital wire transfer authorization glowing on my computer screen. The estate lawyer had finalized the negotiations with the bank. I only needed to click one button to execute the multi-million-dollar purchase and formally transfer the debt to the trust. Would you spend millions of your family's money to buy the chain currently wrapped around your enemy's neck? Would you risk a massive inheritance to spring a trap, knowing a single legal misstep could bankrupt your own sister? I hovered the mouse over the authorization button, my hand shaking visibly. A cold sweat broke out across my shoulders. The sheer magnitude of the transaction paralyzed me. I was a masonry contractor, accustomed to calculating the cost of lime mortar and scaffolding rentals. I was about to move millions of dollars in a single keystroke, committing Caroline's financial future to a high-stakes game of corporate chicken. If Wyatt's attorneys found a loophole, if they successfully challenged my fiduciary discretion in a federal court, the trust could be drained by legal fees, and Caroline would be left with nothing. The fear threatened to override my logic. I pulled my hand away from the mouse, wiping my sweaty palms on my denim jeans. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath. I pictured Caroline sitting on the bench in Forsyth Park, sobbing over the credit reports Wyatt forged in her name. I pictured the stop work orders pasted across my active job sites, his fraternity brothers laughing at my livelihood. I remembered Aunt Vivian handing me a glass of ice water, trusting the girl in the mud to build a strong foundation. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. Wyatt chose the battlefield. He decided to weaponize the legal system and exploit my family's vulnerabilities. I was simply returning fire with an artillery he never imagined I possessed. I opened my eyes and clicked the mouse. The screen flashed a green confirmation message. The wire transfer was complete. The trust now held the deed to his ruin. I printed the confirmation documents, slipping them into a plain manila folder. I did not wear my dirty work boots or my faded Carhartt jacket to the signing. I wore a tailored black suit, the fabric crisp and immaculate. I was not playing the role of the overwhelmed laborer anymore. I was the executioner, preparing to drop the blade. I drove to his sleek commercial real estate office in Buckhead, the engine of my truck humming a steady, confident rhythm. I knew Wyatt would be waiting in his glass-walled conference room, surrounded by his sycophantic lawyers, ready to gloat over his perceived victory. He expected me to walk in and hand him his salvation. He had no idea I was walking in holding the heavy iron chain that would drag him straight to the bottom of the ocean. But the final confrontation would not unfold as a simple exchange of paperwork. Caroline, armed with the devastating knowledge of his identity theft, would step out of the shadows, forcing a chaotic and explosive reckoning just 5 days before the Thanksgiving holiday my mother had exiled me from. The lobby of Wyatt's commercial brokerage firm was an intimidating expanse of polished chrome and frosted glass designed to project an image of unshakable liquidity. The receptionist offered a tight, practiced smile, her eyes lingering briefly on my tailored black suit. I imagined she was expecting the dirty laborer Wyatt had likely mocked in the break room. She escorted me down a long hallway, the thick carpet silencing our footsteps. It was exactly 5 days before Thanksgiving. Outside the glass walls, Buckhead was consumed by the frantic, status-obsessed holiday preparation, where securing a smoked turkey from the right artisan caterer dictated social standing. Inside this office, the only currency that mattered was leverage. The heavy glass doors of the main conference room slid open. Wyatt sat at the head of a massive mahogany table flanked by his lead attorney and a junior associate. He wore a pristine gray suit, exuding the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. The fabricated probate settlement agreement rested in the center of the table, a crisp white stack of paper representing his $15 million salvation. "Grace," he said, rising smoothly to offer a hand. I did not take. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable. This settlement protects Caroline's interests and allows my firm to finalize the acquisition. It is a win for the family." I looked at the settlement papers, the arrogance of his statement burning in my chest. He actually believed he had manipulated the blue-collar spinster into submission. I stepped forward, placing my hands flat on the mahogany table. "I am not signing that document, Wyatt," I said, my voice low and steady, slicing through his manufactured charm. Wyatt's smile faltered, the facade cracking slightly. The lead attorney frowned, leaning forward. "Ms. Grace, we negotiated these terms in good faith. If you back out now, we will immediately resume the probate litigation. We will argue you are acting in bad faith and demand your removal as trustee. You do not have the resources to fight this." I did not break eye contact with Wyatt. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of stapled documents. I dropped them directly on top of his fabricated settlement agreement, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. "I am not backing out," I stated, maintaining the clinical tone of a forensic auditor. "I am executing my discretionary authority. The trust has officially purchased the toxic debt holding your failing homestead development. We bought the notes from your private equity lenders this morning. The wire transfer cleared an hour ago." The blood drained from Wyatt's face, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His lead attorney snatched the documents, scanning the cover page, his eyes widening in shock. "You did what Wyatt whispered," his voice cracking, the confident southern drawl vanishing entirely. "The trust now owns your commercial debt," I clarified, watching the realization dawn in his eyes. "You are no longer dealing with an impatient bank. You are dealing with me. I am your primary creditor. You are financially indentured to the very trust you tried to drain." Wyatt stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is illegal," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You cannot use her inheritance to buy toxic debt. It is a breach of fiduciary duty. Caroline will sue you. She will strip you of the title, and I will have the court reverse the transaction." He was clinging to his last desperate lifeline, hoping the golden child would continue to blindly defend him. He assumed Caroline's vanity and her desperation for a high society wedding would override any logical self-preservation. He was wrong. The glass doors of the conference room slid open again. Caroline walked in. She was not wearing her designer sunglasses or the heavy makeup she used to mask her anxiety. She wore a simple dark sweater, her face bare and resolute. She stepped up to the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. "When the golden child finally turns on the parasite, do you trust her? Or is it just another manipulation born of self-preservation?" I had spent the morning explaining the legal strategy to Caroline. I showed her the debt acquisition portfolio and explained that aligning with me, acting as a unified front, was the only way to insulate her from the federal fallout of his identity theft. By publicly severing ties and allowing the trust to hold his debt, she created a firewall between his fraudulent LLCs and her compromised credit score. She realized the sister she mocked was the only person offering her a clean exit from a burning building. "I am not suing anyone," Caroline said, her voice remarkably steady, holding Wyatt's horrified gaze. "I authorize the investment. Grace is acting in my best interest." Wyatt stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Caroline," he pleaded, stepping toward her, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "What are you doing? We are getting married in 2 months. We are building a life together. You cannot let her do this to us." Caroline reached into her purse, pulling out a small velvet box. She opened it, retrieving the heavy diamond engagement ring he had used to secure her loyalty. She did not throw it at him. She did not yell. She simply dropped the ring onto the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, metallic clatter, resting directly on top of the debt acquisition files. "There is no wedding," she stated, the finality of the words hanging heavy in the room. "I ran a credit check, Wyatt. I know about the 5 credit lines you opened using my Social Security number. I know you forged my signature to float your failing business. You stole my identity. If you ever contact me again, I will hand the reports directly to the police." The room went dead silent. The 2 attorneys stared at Wyatt, stepping subtly away from him, actively distancing themselves from a client who had just been accused of federal fraud in front of witnesses. Wyatt looked at the ring, then at the debt documents, then at the 2 sisters standing united against him. His entire world, the fabricated old money persona, the elite commercial real estate empire, the lavish wedding plans, collapsed in the span of 5 minutes. He was trapped. The trust owned his debt, and his fiancée held the proof of his criminal identity theft. A primal, frantic desperation flashed in his eyes. He lunged forward, reaching for the fabricated settlement agreement resting beneath my files. "I will not let you ruin me," he snarled, attempting to snatch the papers, intending to destroy the evidence of his extortion. I reacted with an unhinged, excessive aggression, born from months of absorbing his insults and municipal sabotage. I slammed my hand down on the papers, pinning them to the table. I snatched the settlement agreement from beneath his fingers, my grip so tight the heavy parchment nearly tore in half. "Do not touch my property," I hissed, leaning over the table, the clinical facade breaking to reveal the raw, furious laborer underneath. "You are done, Wyatt. Your firm will disown you the moment they see these documents. Your creditors are me. You have nothing left to leverage." I shoved the crumpled settlement agreement into my portfolio and turned my back on him, grabbing Caroline's arm and guiding her out of the conference room. We walked down the silent hallway, leaving Wyatt standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. The trap had snapped shut with flawless surgical precision. I had secured my sister's future and neutralized the parasite. But the financial execution was not complete. Holding his debt was only the first step. The final maneuver, the total annihilation of his career, required me to exercise the full, terrifying power of my new position, initiating a public and devastating legal process that would bring an unexpected, heavy emotional cost I was not prepared to pay. The silent drive back from Wyatt's office felt like moving through a vacuum. Caroline stared out the passenger window of my truck, her hands resting limply in her lap, the phantom weight of the discarded engagement ring lingering in the quiet cab. The shock of the confrontation had anesthetized her, but I knew the pain was waiting just beneath the surface. I dropped her off at my house in Inman Park, instructing her to pack a bag. I was moving her to a secure hotel downtown until the initial fallout settled. I needed her insulated from the incoming shrapnel. I drove to my contracting office, locking the heavy steel door behind me. The workspace smelled of dry mortar and old coffee. My crews were back on their scaffolding, the municipal permits restored, but the business felt distant, like a secondary concern. I sat down at my scarred wooden desk, opening the heavy leather portfolio containing the trust documents and the newly acquired commercial debt notes, Wyatt was technically correct about one thing. The commercial real estate market was incredibly tight. His homestead project was bleeding cash daily, unable to secure new tenants or secondary funding. The original private equity lenders had issued a margin call, demanding a massive capital injection to cover the depreciating value of the asset. When they sold the debt to the trust, that margin call did not vanish. It transferred. As the primary creditor representing the irrevocable discretionary trust, I possess the legal authority to enforce the terms of the loan. I did not need to manufacture a reason to destroy him. The natural consequences of his chronic overleverage provided the perfect weapon. I drafted a formal demand letter executing an immediate margin call on his commercial properties. The terms were identical to the original banknote, giving him 48 hours to produce $4.2 million in liquid capital. If he failed to satisfy the demand, the trust would initiate aggressive foreclosure proceedings, seizing the physical assets and liquidating his holding companies to recover the investment. I emailed the demand letter to his lead attorney, copying the senior partners at his boutique brokerage firm. I knew he did not have the cash. He had maxed out Caroline's forged credit lines just to float his daily operating expenses. He was drowning, and I had just ordered the removal of his only life raft. The 48-hour window expired on a Tuesday morning. No funds were wired. No desperate settlement offers were proposed. Wyatt's legal team, recognizing the inescapable reality of the defaulted debt, formally withdrew their representation. They abandoned him, refusing to tie their firm's reputation to a sinking ship facing an impending federal tax evasion probe. I contacted my estate lawyer, authorizing the immediate filing of the foreclosure documents. I did not want a quiet administrative seizure. I wanted the execution to be public, reflecting the very same social humiliation he had inflicted on my sister. I hired a specialized private courier service, known for their aggressive delivery tactics. I provided them with Wyatt's schedule, mapping his daily movements through the elite circles of Buckhead. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Wyatt was sitting in the main dining room of a prestigious private country club, surrounded by potential clients and affluent golf buddies. He was desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control, projecting the image of a successful broker, despite the collapse of his engagement and his law firm partnership. The courier bypassed the club's discreet reception desk, marching directly into the dining room. He did not attempt to be subtle. He approached Wyatt's table, slapping a thick stack of formal foreclosure notices directly onto the white linen tablecloth, spilling a glass of iced tea in the process. "You have been served," he announced, his voice cutting through the polite murmur of the country club. "The trust has initiated foreclosure on your homestead properties." The humiliation was absolute and financially lethal. The men sitting at the table, recognizing the fatal severity of a public foreclosure, scattered immediately. They physically distanced themselves from a toxic asset. Within an hour, the club's board of directors quietly informed Wyatt his membership privileges were suspended, pending a review of his financial standing. He lost his job, his social status, and his fiancée in the span of a single afternoon. The dirty worker he had mocked and tried to starve out now held the deed to his entire professional existence. What does ultimate financial victory feel like when the cost is detonating your own family's stability? Do you feel the righteous satisfaction of a victorious general, or do you just feel the cold, isolating silence of the battlefield? I sat at my scarred wooden desk, the confirmed foreclosure receipts resting neatly in a file folder. The execution was complete. The parasite was eradicated. I had secured Aunt Vivian's $15 million legacy, ensuring Caroline would not inherit a mountain of fraudulent debt. The logic center of my brain cataloged the victory, checking the boxes of a successful forensic operation. But the victory tasted like ash in my mouth. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, pulling out a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon. I did not bother with a glass. I unscrewed the cap, the sharp, metallic scent of the alcohol filling my small office. I took a long, burning pull straight from the bottle, the liquid searing a path down my throat to settle hot and heavy in my stomach. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. I had won the war, but the collateral damage was devastating. I had forcefully ripped the veil off my sister's fairy tale, exposing her to the ugly, terrifying reality of identity theft and betrayal. I had watched her dream of a perfect Buckhead wedding burn to the ground. I shattered the fragile illusion my mother had sacrificed her own wedding ring to maintain. I was the architect of their salvation, but the rescue required tearing down the very house they lived in. A raw, ragged sob tore through my chest, shattering the clinical stoicism I had maintained for weeks. I cried alone in my dusty office, the tears tracking hot and fast through the brick dust still clinging to my skin. I mourned the sister who would have to spend months in trauma therapy, untangling her credit score from a criminal. I mourned the mother who was sitting in her empty house, terrified of a poverty she could not escape. I mourned the fact that protecting my family required me to become the monster they always accused me of being. I took another long pull from the bourbon bottle, letting the alcohol numb the sharp edges of my grief. The financial guillotine had dropped, executing the threat with surgical precision. But the emotional fallout of the foreclosure was about to manifest in the quiet, devastating reality of the impending holiday. The Thanksgiving feast my mother had planned to showcase her elite status was rapidly approaching, and the empty chairs around her table would force a bitter, ironic reckoning that would alter the trajectory of our fractured family forever. The rapid collapse of Wyatt's commercial empire sent shockwaves through the insulated elite circles of Atlanta. The public foreclosure at the country club was the initial blast, but I needed to ensure the bridges connecting him to his phantom safety net were permanently burned. Wyatt had consistently leveraged the reputation of his wealthy parents to intimidate Julianne and manipulate my mother. He projected an aura of invincible old money aristocracy, assuming his family name would shield him from the consequences of his fraud. I decided to test the strength of that lineage. The day after the foreclosure, I instructed my estate attorney to mail a certified copy of the final decree directly to the primary residence of Wyatt's parents in Alpharetta. I included a brief clinical summary outlining the specific details of his identity theft involving their future daughter-in-law. I knew his parents were fiercely protective of their social standing. I calculated that the exposure of his criminal liability, the undeniable proof that their son was running a sophisticated financial scam, would trigger a swift and ruthless excommunication to protect their own legacy. My calculation was flawless. The phantom aristocracy did not rally to defend their son. They abandoned him instantly, severing all contact to insulate their remaining assets from his impending federal tax evasion indictment. They canceled their attendance at the highly anticipated Thanksgiving dinner, sending a terse 2-sentence email to Beatrice, formally withdrawing from the event and the impending wedding. Thanksgiving morning dawned with a heavy, overcast sky, the typical lingering warmth of a Georgia autumn, muted by a damp, persistent chill. Inman Park was quiet, the streets lined with fallen oak leaves, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from neighborhood chimneys. I woke up early, the silence of my restored craftsman home feeling expansive and isolating. I did not have to worry about changing out of my dirty work boots. I did not have to brace myself for the subtle passive-aggressive insults regarding my trade. My mother had successfully engineered a holiday table completely free of the blue-collar embarrassment she so deeply feared. But the pristine table she envisioned was currently sitting empty in Buckhead. I spent the morning imagining the scene unfolding miles away in my mother's immaculate colonial house. Beatrice had spent weeks preparing for this specific day, planning a menu designed to impress the very people who had just disowned her golden child. I could picture the lavish spread resting on the polished mahogany dining table. A massive glazed ham, an ornate silver tureen of homemade cornbread dressing, crystal bowls filled with slow-cooked collard greens and sweet potato casserole. It was a feast built to secure a fake social alliance, a culinary bribe to appease a monster. Now the feast sat untouched, cooling rapidly in the silent dining room. Caroline was sequestered in her childhood bedroom, mourning the loss of her fairy tale, nursing the heavy, humiliating realization that she was legally tethered to a con artist. Beatrice was likely pacing the foyer, twisting her bare left ring finger, staring at the empty chairs. The Buckhead illusion was dead. The socialite facade had shattered, leaving two terrified women trapped in a house filled with expensive cold food. When the people who exiled you finally experience the isolation they engineered, do you feel vindicated? Or do you just feel the hollow ache of the void they left behind? I roasted a small chicken for myself, making a single serving of mashed potatoes and green beans. I ate, sitting on a stool at my kitchen island, staring out the window at the gray sky. The victory was absolute. I had executed my fiduciary duty, neutralizing the threat and preserving Aunt Vivian's $15 million legacy. I protected Caroline from total financial ruin. I exposed the parasite. But the righteous satisfaction I expected, the triumphant feeling of outsmarting the elite snobs, never materialized. The victory tasted like dust. By mid-afternoon, the silence in my house became unbearable. The ghosts of Thanksgivings past, the memory of noisy, chaotic family dinners before the 2008 crash, warped my mother's mind, crowded into the quiet corners of my living room. I needed to move. I grabbed my keys, throwing on a heavy denim jacket, and climbed into my battered work truck. I did not plan a destination, but my hands steered the truck toward Buckhead, operating on a deep, buried instinct. The streets were deserted. The affluent neighborhood shuttered behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. I turned onto my mother's street, slowing the truck as I approached her colonial house. I parked across the street, idling the engine in the fading afternoon light. The house looked picture-perfect. The exterior painted a crisp white, the lawn impeccably maintained. But the windows were dark. No cars were parked in the wide circular driveway. No welcoming lights spilled out onto the front porch. The isolation radiating from the property was palpable, heavy, and deeply sad. I sat in the cab of my truck, the heater blasting warm air against my frozen fingers. I looked at the heavy oak front door. I could have walked up the brick pathway. I could have knocked on the door, offering my bruised, shattered family a lifeline. I could have stepped into the quiet house and hugged my mother, telling her we survived the storm. I could have been the bigger person, crossing the boundary I had fought so hard to establish. But the pain of the exile still burned too hot in my chest. The memory of my mother's text message, the absolute rejection of my honest labor, anchored me to the driver's seat. I was too proud to beg for a seat at a table that had explicitly rejected me. I was too hurt to offer comfort to the women who had mocked my calloused hands. The imperfect, stubborn contractor refused to yield to the forgiving daughter. I sat in the dark for 20 minutes, watching the shadows lengthen across my mother's pristine lawn. Then I shifted the truck into drive and pulled away from the curb, driving back to the quiet sanctuary of Inman Park. The family was safe from the parasite, but the truth had shattered the foundation, leaving us isolated in our respective corners. The financial war was over, but rebuilding the emotional wreckage would require a grueling, honest labor that could not be outsourced to lawyers or accountants. It would require stripping away the polished lies and getting our hands dirty, a challenge that would test the very limits of our resilience in the months to come. The long shadow of Thanksgiving slowly receded, giving way to the sharp, brisk chill of late December in Georgia. The frantic holiday season, usually defined by aggressive socializing and conspicuous consumption, arrived with a muted, quiet reality for my fractured family. The fallout from the financial execution settled into the public record, finalizing the destruction of the illusion Beatrice had spent 16 years constructing. The federal tax evasion probe I triggered systematically dismantled Wyatt's remaining defenses. The IRS investigators were not uncreative. They were relentless. They audited the trail of shell companies and the fraudulent escrow accounts, uncovering a staggering depth of financial mismanagement. Wyatt accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. The terms of his probation were a masterclass in poetic justice. A judge mandated 500 hours of mandatory community service, specifically restricting him to manual labor for the county parks department. The quintessential Southern gentleman who mocked my dirty boots and leveraged his fraternity connections to freeze my scaffolding permits was now wearing an orange visibility vest, picking up trash along the shoulders of Interstate 85. The man who tried to steal $15 million to avoid getting his hands dirty was legally required to sweat in the Georgia sun, Caroline's recovery was a slower, more agonizing process. The consumer protection attorney successfully froze her compromised credit lines, but untangling her name from the identity theft would take years of administrative battles. She was technically safe from Wyatt's legal liabilities, but she was left with the devastating reality of her own vanity. She had $80,000 in legitimate consumer debt, accumulated over months of funding her fake Buckhead lifestyle. The designer wedding dresses, the lavish bridal shower, deposits, the imported shoes, all remained on her ledger. She was broke, living in her childhood bedroom, staring at a mountain of bills she had no idea how to pay. She assumed I would eventually unlock Aunt Vivian's trust to bail her out. She waited, expecting the dirty worker to clean up the mess with a single, massive wire transfer. I did not release the funds. The trust remained sealed, an impenetrable fortress under my absolute discretionary control. I knew that handing Caroline $15 million before she understood the value of a single dollar would be catastrophic. Wealth in the hands of the insecure is a weapon they will inevitably use against themselves. Aunt Vivian wrote those words in her final letter, and I intended to honor her directive. Caroline needed to learn how to brace for the wind before I handed her the keys to the shelter. 2 weeks before Christmas, I drove to my mother's house in Buckhead. I did not knock on the heavy oak door. I walked up the brick pathway and placed a single item on the welcome mat. It was a pair of heavy, thick leather work gloves, still carrying the faint smell of lime mortar and red clay. It was a silent, challenging invitation. A choice between the polished lies she grew up believing and the grueling, honest reality I could offer her. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was driving down the interstate toward a new commercial restoration site in Savannah. The caller ID displayed Caroline's name. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice flat and neutral. "Grace," she said, her voice lacking the melodic, confident cadence of her past life. It sounded smaller, but remarkably steady. "I want to work for you. I need to pay off my debt, and I do not want Mom to take out another loan. I want to learn how to do what you do." The silence stretched in the cab of my truck, the hum of the tires against the asphalt, the only sound. "It is not glamorous, Caroline," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "You will be up at 5 in the morning. You will be mixing mortar, hauling bricks, and sweeping scaffolding. You will be covered in dirt, and your hands will blister. I am not going to treat you like a princess on the job site. You will earn minimum wage until you prove you can handle the trowel." "I know," she replied without hesitation. "I put the gloves on, Grace. They fit. Can honest dirt wash away the sins of a family obsessed with polished lies? Can the physical, grueling labor of rebuilding a broken wall teach a person how to rebuild their own shattered character?" A week later, Caroline was standing on a metal grating 40 feet above the historic cobblestone streets of Savannah. The coastal winter air was damp and biting through our heavy canvas jackets. We were restoring the crumbling facade of a 19th century cotton exchange. Caroline was covered head to toe in fine red brick dust. Her hair was tied back, her fingernails caked with dark mortar. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the heavy bucket she was hauling. But she was not complaining. She was not checking her phone or worrying about her reflection in the glass windows. She was watching me, carefully observing the precise angle of my wrist as I chipped away the rotten mortar and applied the fresh binding paste. She was learning how to spot a weak foundation. She was learning how to build something real. We worked side by side in companionable silence, the rhythmic scrape of the trowel against the brick, replacing the toxic noise of our past. We were not fixing our relationship with long, emotional conversations or dramatic apologies. We were fixing it by simply sharing the weight of the work. For the first time in our lives, we were standing on equal ground. My relationship with Beatrice, however, remained a casualty of the war. My mother was living quietly in her massive, empty Buckhead house, forced to face the true origins of her trauma without the distraction of a golden child's wedding. She no longer had an elite son-in-law to brag about at the country club. The illusion she pawned her wedding ring to maintain had evaporated, leaving her completely isolated. She called me twice a week, leaving tentative, hesitant voicemails, asking about my business and suggesting we grab coffee. I listened to the messages sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my Inman Park home, but I did not call her back. The imperfect, stubborn contractor still held the reins. I was holding on to residual anger, unable to fully forgive the mother who exiled me from her table to appease a monster. The boundary I established on Thanksgiving remained intact, rigid, and unforgiving. I was healing, but I was still deeply flawed, unready to offer complete absolution. I stood on the scaffolding in Savannah, wiping a streak of sweat from my forehead with the back of my leather glove. I looked out over the historic district, watching the coastal fog roll in off the river. I looked at Caroline, kneeling on the metal grating, focused entirely on leveling a damaged brick. We had survived the parasite. We had dismantled the fake empire and preserved Aunt Vivian's legacy. The $15 million trust remained safely locked away, waiting for the day my sister finally understood the true value of the dirt beneath her boots. The emotional wreckage of my family was still scattered across the landscape, but the foundation we were building now, the bond forged in red clay and honest sweat, was finally solid. We were imperfect, we were bruised, and we were still learning how to navigate the cold draft of our history. But as the winter sun broke through the coastal fog, casting a warm light against the newly restored brick facade, I knew with absolute certainty that this foundation would never crumble again. Looking back at the day I stood on the scaffolding, staring down at my shattered windshield, the pain of my mother's exile feels like a necessary, brutal catalyst. I often ask myself how a family can survive a betrayal orchestrated by the very people meant to provide sanctuary. We survived because I stopped trying to force my way into a dining room that was built on a crumbling fastening. Fraudulent foundation. I stopped apologizing for the dirt on my hands and realized the grit was my greatest asset. Navigating the wreckage of my family taught me 5 uncompromising truths about wealth, worth, and the toxic nature of conditional love. First, an honest living is the ultimate armor against manipulation. Wyatt and Beatrice believed my blue-collar trade made me vulnerable and unrefined. They failed to realize that the discipline required to build a business from the ground up gave me the exact forensic resilience needed to dismantle their lies. You cannot extort someone who knows how to survive in the dirt. Second, wealth in the hands of the insecure is a weapon they will inevitably use against themselves. Aunt Vivian understood this deeply. Caroline's desire for a $15 million payout was entirely driven by her need to project elite status. By locking the trust and forcing my sister to learn the value of a single hard-earned dollar, I didn't just protect her inheritance, I saved her character. True financial security is meaningless without the emotional maturity to manage it. Third, a trauma response is an explanation, never an excuse. I finally understood that my mother's obsession with high society was a panicked reaction to her impoverished Appalachian childhood. She exiled me to protect me from the snobbery she endured, but understanding her pain does not require me to absorb her abuse. You can have profound empathy for the broken people who raised you, while firmly refusing to let them break you in return. Fourth, the loudest people in the room are usually hiding the deepest rot. Wyatt spent years projecting an image of invincible old money, mocking anyone who actually worked for a living. His entire persona was a desperate, panicked distraction from his massive federal tax evasion. True power is quiet. It doesn't need to brag at a country club luncheon. It simply buys the debt of the person screaming the loudest. Fifth, and finally, more than a boundary is only as strong as your willingness to enforce it. I still do not answer my mother's phone calls. I am imperfect, more than holding on to residual anger. But I accept that complete forgiveness is not a requirement for peace. Protecting your peace sometimes means loving your family from a very deliberate, quiet distance. The scaffolding in Savannah is coming down soon, revealing a perfectly restored 19th century facade. Caroline is exhausted, covered in mortar, but she is finally standing on her own 2 feet, free from the parasite who tried to drain her. The foundation we are building together is messy and difficult, but it is real. If you are listening to this right now and you feel like the black sheep of your family, remember that your rough edges are often the exact tools you need to survive their polished lies. You do not need a seat at a toxic table when you know how to build your own house. Thank you for joining me here on Sofia Told Stories. If my journey resonated with your own struggles, please drop a comment below and share the hardest boundary you ever had to draw. Do not forget to subscribe and join our growing community. Your peace is worth fighting for, and your story deserves to be heard. I will see you in the next one.